America's currently experiencing a dire economic situation. And it's very unfortunate because in a country like America, you'd expect the elected officials to be able to handle such a situation not with ease, but with some sense of urgency. Now, what's shocking right now is that the lawmakers haven't actually agreed on another stimulus bill. And we do know that if another stimulus bill isn't passed, then many millions of Americans will plunge further into poverty. Now, it's not just our word for this. There have been many research-backed studies which carefully look into how the stimulus and the CARES Act actually helped Americans through the midst of the pandemic. The results are actually not that surprising when you take into account many people lost their jobs. Millions of Americans were actually plunged out of poverty by the stimulus check. And it's quite shocking because $1,200 doesn't seem like that much. But when you're living paycheck to paycheck, or you just lose your job, the $1,200 that the stimulus provides and the unemployment benefits are actually pretty decent. However, unfortunately, we do know that the American policymakers haven't actually managed to reach a deal just yet. And currently, as we are recording this video, the election hasn't passed. Now, to us, whether or not the Democrats or Republicans are elected, what we do want to see from the policymakers is that the American people are the priority. Because what I think the politicians actually fail to understand, it's that it's not the Dems versus the Republicans. It's actually us versus the virus. We actually need to come together as a country and defeat the virus together. And just put aside old rivalries, because right now isn't the time for debates and politics. You see, if we dilly-dally around while other economies like China and New Zealand actually have effective measures to beating the virus and have done so effectively, making the country of America look like a laughingstock, the economic situation in America will really begin to deteriorate. Now, every time the economy seems to deteriorate, we see the Federal Reserve and the policymakers get together and sort of what we tend to see is the policymakers and the people at the top get together and start to form some sort of stimulus check. Now, the reason I think this is good but also bad is for one of two reasons. You see, when you prop up the economy artificially, it's only a temporary boost. You see, right now, America's economy is propped up artificially because you see the stimulus did help. It was good. It helped people get out of poverty and helped people in a rough time. But it doesn't help right now because the pandemic is still here. You see, if the pandemic disappeared tomorrow, things would eventually return to normal. But the pandemic is here and it doesn't seem to be leaving anytime soon. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to effectively supplement the loss of jobs and the loss of economic activity that the virus caused. You see, if we just every now and again pump $1,200 into the banks of Americans, it's only going to be a matter of time before they're going to need it again, which is a very bad problem. Because if every 3 to 4 months you're going to need to give Americans $1,200, it just simply is a recipe for disaster and a recipe for hyperinflation. However, on the other side, if we don't do this, what we can see is millions of Americans just missing their rent payments. Let's take a look at this article by Salon.com. This article deeply dives in onto how, without the stimulus, 12 million Americans will owe more than $5,000 in missed rent by December. Now, of course, this isn't something that's set in stone. It's an analysis done by the economic experts. And it states that rent debt could top $70 billion by the end of the year if Republicans keep blocking additional coronavirus relief. We already know that earlier on in the year, when the pandemic hit, millions of Americans did miss their mortgage payments, and there was some sort of scheme that actually helped people get past this. However, the pandemic is still here, and people are starting to once again, without the stimulus, miss payments. And because of this, things are going to start to deteriorate. If we don't act now and we keep waiting, it's going to be a while before there's some economic recovery. Let's go further into what this article states. It states, while most renters are protected from eviction by a Center for Disease Control Preventative Directive, which expires at the end of the year, missed payments have been piling up. The Philadelphia Fed estimates that the outstanding rent debt could reach $7.2 billion by the end of the year. Like the patchwork of state and local moratoriums preceding it, The temporary federal eviction moratorium has protected many renters from the threat of losing their homes in the middle of a pandemic. However, our analysis suggests that this stopgap measure has left millions of additional households, many owing thousands of dollars back rent, at risk when the moratorium expires. The researchers wrote, "These households are primarily those with workers who lost jobs yet did not receive state or federal unemployment insurance and other associated CARES Act provisions." The analysis likely does not show the full scope of rental debt. Another Philadelphia Fed analysis by the Consumer Finance Institute also found that credit card payments to businesses connected to the rental real estate increased by more than 70% this spring and remained at about 50% higher through the fall. That suggests many renters may have cleared their rental debts only to rack up credit card debts with mounting interest rates to get by. So even if they're able to make their rent payment, what's going to happen in the future can't be avoided. You see, fair enough that there is a directive which actually prevents people from becoming evicted until December. But just note, until this is extended or there's some sort of extension proposed, this is going to be something that expires in December. Now, unless they actually propose to extend this, which I highly advise that they would, considering the pandemic is going to be much worse going into winter, it looks like the rental market may collapse. You see, there's going to be millions of people who have missed payments, millions of Americans who don't have the money to actually pay their rent and are actually continuing to accrue debts because they don't have a job and there's no stimulus to help them through this tough time. So what's going to happen in December when this directive expires and millions of Americans have either high credit card debt, no money to pay for rent, and there's no stimulus in the economy? Well, we're going to see a huge economic fallout, which could leave many millions of Americans homeless. And this is not good. Many of Americans probably won't be homeless. They're probably going to move to cheaper cities. So once again, the rental market is going to take another hit. Now, what's also going to happen is that there's many different landlords that are actually struggling to meet their mortgage payments. Now, if you know how rental property works, you know that the majority of rental properties that the real estate industry has is owned by banks. And of course, the landlords actually have mortgages to be able to rent out these properties. Now, of course, these landlords actually rely on the rental payments to cover their mortgage payments. And what do you think happens when these landlords don't have those rental payments? They start to fall behind on their mortgage payments, which is once again another economic blow to the real estate industry. So we do know that right now the Americans, if they don't get another stimulus, we could be looking at a very, very harsh economic winter.